All right, welcome. Today, we are diving into a really tough question, and a really important one. What do the early Christian texts, the New Testament, actually have to say about the institution of slavery?
You have to remember, slavery wasn't just a thing in the Roman Empire. It was woven into the very fabric of life. It was everywhere, a huge part of the social and economic reality. So for the early Christian writers, this wasn't some abstract ethical debate. So the question for us, and the one we're really going to dig into, is how did they actually address it? Did they push back? Did they accept it? Something else entirely?
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at slavery as a metaphor. Then, we'll shift to how the texts acknowledge it as a social reality. After that, we get into the really direct stuff, the instructions given to the enslaved. We'll then ask why those instructions were given, looking at the stated rationale. And finally, we'll put it all together in its first-century framework. Let's get into it.
All right. First up, before we even touch on literal physical slavery, we've got to understand something crucial. For the early Christians, the language of slavery, well, that was a really powerful spiritual tool. They used it all the time, but not always in the way you might think.
Yeah, check this out. The idea of slavery gets used in two completely opposite ways. On one hand, you have the Apostle Paul saying he's become your slaves for Jesus' sake. That's a radical statement of devotion and service. But then you flip it, and in 2 Peter, false teachers are called slaves of corruption. See? It's the same word, the same concept, but it's used to describe both this incredible positive devotion and this total negative state of being trapped by sin.
And it's not just a one-off thing. This metaphor is everywhere. Paul introduces himself as a slave of Jesus Christ. The letter to Titus talks about people being slaves to various passions and pleasures. Hebrews even talks about being freed from slavery by the fear of death. So in all these cases, you see the language of slavery being used to paint a picture of a really powerful spiritual condition, either being totally devoted to God or being completely trapped by sin and fear.
Okay, so we've seen the metaphor, but now we need to shift gears, because these texts aren't just speaking symbolically. They also deal with slavery as a literal real-world institution. It was a basic fact of Roman life, and the writers, well, they didn't shy away from it.
And you see it mentioned just as a fact of life, you know? The book of Revelation describes a time when everyone, slave and free, would be affected. Jesus uses this really common, everyday example, saying, no slave can serve 2 masters. It's clear that they're talking about a real social category here. These aren't metaphors anymore. This is just them describing the world they lived in.
So this is where things get really direct. And honestly, for a lot of us reading this today, this is where it gets really difficult, because several of these letters give very specific commands directly to Christians who were enslaved.
Take the letter of 1 Peter, for example. It says, flat out, that enslaved people should accept their master's authority with all deference. But then it goes a step further, and this is the part that's really jarring. It says this applies not just to the good and gentle masters, but also to the ones who are harsh.
And it's not an isolated command. 1 Timothy, which comes out of that same Pauline tradition, says something very similar. It tells those under the yoke of slavery to treat their masters as worthy of all honor. But then it adds this whole other layer. What if your master is also a Christian? Well, the text says you shouldn't be disrespectful, but instead you must serve them all the more. The reason? Because you're both part of the same believing community.
So when you line these instructions up, you start to see a really clear pattern, right? Accept your master's authority, even if they're harsh. Show them honor. And if your master is a believer, you have to serve them even better. And all of this just begs the question, why? What was the thinking behind giving this kind of advice?
Okay, let's dig into that why. Because the texts don't just drop these commands and walk away. They actually give reasons for them. And getting a handle on those reasons, that's absolutely crucial if we want to understand what was going on in the minds of these early Christians.
Now, many scholars will frame this advice as part of what they call a missional strategy. You have to put yourself in their shoes. The early Christians were a small, marginalized group. They were often viewed with suspicion. One text from the period calls them a sect everywhere spoken against. So how they behaved in public, especially within the Roman household structure, wasn't just a private matter. It was their main form of testimony. It was a public statement about what their faith was all about.
And the texts are pretty explicit about this. 1 Timothy says the goal is so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed. It's all about public relations, basically. It's about not giving outsiders a reason to speak badly about their God. 1 Peter frames it as being a testimony to the faith. And then there's the deep theological reason. It all comes back to imitating the example of Christ.
The idea was to follow in his steps by enduring unjust suffering, just like he did.
You can actually see the theological logic play out in 1 Peter. It's like a 3-step process. Step 1, endure unjust suffering. Don't fight back. Step 2, reframe that suffering. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a way of following Christ's powerful example. And finally, step 3, trust that real justice, real vindication isn't going to come from a rebellion or from human courts. It's going to come from God at the final judgment.
Okay, so let's try to pull all of this together. We've looked at the metaphors, the reality, the commands, and the reasons. What's the big picture here? What was the driving force? Well, it really seems to come down to a very pragmatic mix of two things: survival and witness.
At the end of the day, what we're looking at here aren't some abstract philosophical essays written from a position of power and comfort. Far from it. These were practical letters written to small, vulnerable groups of people who were just trying to survive. And their primary goals seem to have been protecting the community and making sure their new faith looked honorable, not like some dangerous, subversive cult to the Romans watching them.
So to sum up the context, you have these marginalized communities. They're trying to avoid scandal at all costs. Their strategy was to fit into the existing social structures, like the Roman household, as a way of providing a positive testimony. And the whole thing was underpinned by this powerful theological idea: follow the example of Christ, who also suffered unjustly.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. When we understand that this advice wasn't written in a vacuum, that it was forged in the very specific context of a vulnerable minority group focused on survival and public witness, how does that change the way we read and think about these really challenging texts in our world today? Which is, of course, a very, very different place.